I'm
should
so
have
glad to
told you
have you
all
here.
years ago.
Follow my story
I
until
am
the
so
end and comment the
sorry.
city you're watching
Wait, what are you
from.
talking about?
I promise, the ending will be worth it. My name is Carol Rogers, and at 68 years old, apparently to my own family, I'm just the widow now. I ironed my blouse twice before leaving for dinner that evening, checked my lipstick 3 times in the hallway mirror, and told myself not to cry no matter what. It was just dinner, just my family, just the people I'd loved and raised for over 4 decades. The invitation came from Jacob, my eldest son. Estate planning discussion, he'd called it in his text message. So formal, so cold, as if we were discussing some stranger's belongings and not the life his father and I had built together over 45 years of marriage. Richard had been gone for 6 months. 6 months of empty mornings and quiet evenings. 6 months of learning to speak in singular pronouns instead of we and us. 6 months of Jacob and Danielle gradually taking control of family gatherings, family decisions, family everything. I drove slowly to their house, that big, glassy, modern mansion in Westbrook Estates, the one Richard and I had co-signed the loan for when Jacob's startup was still finding its footing. Not that anyone mentioned that fact anymore. The house looked particularly imposing that evening, all lit up against the darkening sky. 3 stories of architectural ambition with a circular driveway where Danielle's Range Rover and Jacob's Tesla were parked like sentinels. I clutched my homemade blueberry pie more tightly. Richard always said it was my best, and I thought maybe it would soften the mood. A peace offering of sorts, though I wasn't sure what I'd done to require one. When Danielle opened the door, her smile didn't reach her eyes. "You're early," she said, though I wasn't. I was precisely on time, as I always am. Being punctual was something Richard and I both valued. "I brought pie," I said, holding it out. She took it with fingertips that barely touched the dish. "We already have dessert," she said, placing it on a side table rather than taking it to the kitchen. I pretended not to notice. Jacob was in the open-concept living area, pouring wine like a sommelier at some exclusive Napa Valley tasting. He barely looked up when I entered. "Mom's here," Danielle announced unnecessarily, her voice carrying that artificial brightness she used at her charity events. "Hey, Mom," Jacob said, still focused on the wine. "Michael and Sarah should be here soon." Michael is my younger son, quieter than Jacob, more like Richard in temperament. He and his wife Sarah were always caught in Jacob and Danielle's orbit, following their lead, rarely standing their ground. I settled into a chair, feeling oddly like a visitor rather than family. The furniture was all sharp angles and uncomfortable fabrics, the kind chosen for appearance rather than function. It summed up Danielle's approach to life perfectly. Lily, my 17-year-old granddaughter, was the only one who seemed genuinely pleased to see me. She came bounding down the stairs, her dark hair swinging, and gave me a real hug. "Grandma, I didn't know you were coming tonight." "Of course she's coming," Danielle cut in quickly. "We're discussing family matters." I caught the slight emphasis on family, and the way Danielle's eyes darted to Lily, silently communicating that she shouldn't be part of this conversation. "I have homework anyway," Lily said, reading the room with the perceptiveness that made me so proud of her. She squeezed my hand before heading back upstairs, and I felt the momentary warmth of her touch long after she'd gone. By the time Michael and Sarah arrived, Danielle was arranging place settings at the dining table, the one I'd bought them last Christmas, though no one mentioned that either. The air was sharp with her expensive perfume and something burning slightly in the oven, a combination that made my chest feel tight. We sat down, 9 of us at the table, Jacob and Danielle at opposite ends, Michael and Sarah to my left, their 2 children, Ben and Emma, across from me. Lily had been relegated to a separate small table in the corner with her younger brother, Jack. The physical separation felt symbolic. Jacob raised his wine glass in what felt like a rehearsed gesture. Thanks for coming tonight. We've been thinking it's time to simplify things. And I knew exactly what that meant. Less of me, more of them. Dinner was an elaborate affair of foods Richard never would have touched. Some kind of deconstructed salad with ingredients I couldn't identify, followed by a too-rare roast that bled onto the white plates. The conversation circled around topics just beyond my reach, people I didn't know, events I hadn't been invited to. I focused on cutting my meat into smaller and smaller pieces while Jacob dominated the conversation, talking about the expansion of his tech company and their plans for a vacation home in Aspen. Danielle interjected with details about the interior designer she'd hired, someone apparently famous who had worked with celebrities I'd never heard of. "We should discuss the practical matters," Michael finally said, glancing at me apologetically. He had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to bridge gaps. "About Dad's estate and everything." Jacob set down his fork with a precise movement. "Right, that's why we're here." He looked at me directly for what felt like the first time that evening. "Mom, we think it would be easier for everyone if we consolidated the assets under the family trust." I blinked, trying to understand what he was proposing. "The trust was set up for after I'm gone," I said carefully. "Richard and I always planned for me to maintain control of our assets during my lifetime." Danielle made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sigh. "That's so complicated, though. And frankly, Carol, do you really want the burden of managing all that at your age?" "My age?" I repeated, feeling a flush creep up my neck. "I'm 68, not 98. Your father and I managed our finances together for decades." "Dad handled most of it," Jacob said dismissively. "Let's be honest." The injustice of that statement made my hand tighten around my water glass. Richard and I had been true partners. Yes, he had been the face of our real estate development business, but I had kept the books, managed the rental properties, and made most of the investment decisions. "I've reviewed the trust documents," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "The current arrangement is what your father and I agreed upon. There's no reason to change things." Jacob exchanged a look with Danielle, the kind of marital telepathy that excludes everyone else. "Have you spoken with Alan Kingsley?" I asked, referring to our family lawyer who had drawn up all our legal documents over the years. "We've been working with a new firm," Jacob said. "More modern approach, better tax strategies." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. They'd gone behind my back to consult with attorneys I didn't know. "Have you spoken to the lawyer about the trust specifically?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. That's when it happened. Danielle didn't even look up from her phone, where she'd been subtly checking messages throughout dinner. She just murmured, "You're just the widow, Carol. Maybe just stay quiet for now." The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of family taking time to think, but the shocked pause that follows something unforgivable. Then Jacob chuckled, actually chuckled, and Michael looked down at his plate, saying nothing. Sarah at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. My hands began to shake beneath the table, not from weakness, but from a sudden, clarifying anger. I had not just lost my husband. I was now losing my place in my own family. I set my napkin down beside my barely touched plate, stood up, and said nothing. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of tears or dramatic speeches. "Mom," Michael finally said, his voice uncertain. I walked to the entryway, collected my purse and cardigan, and left the pie untouched on the side table where Danielle had abandoned it. Behind me, I heard Danielle's voice, artificially concerned. "Is she okay to drive at night?" I closed the door firmly behind me and walked to my car, my back straight despite the weight pressing down on my chest. For the first time in 45 years of family dinners, the silence inside my car felt like peace, not loneliness. They didn't call after me. They didn't follow me out. And they had no idea what I was about to do. I didn't sleep that night. Not even for a minute. I sat in Richard's old brown recliner, wrapped in the throw blanket we used to argue over on cold nights. The one with the frayed edges and the faint coffee stain from when he'd fallen asleep with a mug balanced on the armrest. The house felt like it was holding its breath, and I kept playing their words over and over in my head. You're just the widow. Maybe just stay quiet. Like I was some extra in my own family's life. Like the decades I'd spent raising them, supporting them, loving them counted for nothing now that Richard was gone. Around 2:30 in the morning, I couldn't take the stillness anymore. I stood up, my joints stiff from sitting too long, and walked barefoot across the hardwood floor to Richard's study. The room still smelled faintly of him, that combination of aftershave and the lemon candies he always kept in his desk drawer. I hadn't changed anything since he died. His reading glasses still sat beside the leather blotter. His favorite pen still marked the page in the biography he'd been reading. I went straight to the cabinet we called the no-go zone when the boys were growing up. The place where we kept important papers, passports, insurance documents, all the adult things kids didn't need to touch. My hands were cold when I pulled open the drawer. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Maybe just a reminder that I still belonged somewhere, that Richard hadn't left me completely defenseless in a world that suddenly felt hostile. I pushed aside the familiar papers, insurance policies, birth certificates, the deed to the house, and paused when I saw an old photo of us in Colorado, standing in front of the first property we'd ever developed. We looked so young, so certain of our future together. And that's when I saw it. A thick white envelope wedged at the back of the drawer, labeled in Richard's distinctive handwriting with one word, Carol. I stared at it like it might disappear. Richard wasn't the type to leave sentimental notes. He showed love by making sure the tires were rotated and the gutters didn't clog, not through letters. In 45 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of cards he'd given me that contained more than just his signature. I opened it slowly, my hands already trembling, and inside was a single page of notebook paper and a stack of clipped documents behind it. Carol, the letter began in his familiar handwriting. If you're reading this, something's already gone wrong. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I knew if I did, you'd try to fix it instead of protect yourself. The boys, they're not bad, but they're selfish. And Danielle, she's worse. I saw it happening the moment I got sick. The way they started circling, asking questions about the business, about our investments, about the trust. I made some changes. Everything is in your name. The house, accounts, the lake property, the business holdings. You have full authority and power of attorney. They don't know. Don't feel bad for using it. Don't let them shame you into silence. And if they ever try to take what's yours, burn it all down. I love you. I always have. Richard, I sat there frozen, the weight of it sinking in. I had no idea he'd done this. We'd talked in vague terms about the will, but I thought he was just being cautious, covering all bases the way he always did. I looked through the documents one by one, each official, notarized, sealed with Alan Kingsley's law firm stamp. There were terms I barely understood. Financial control clauses, ownership restructuring, transfer of assets effective immediately upon death. It was all there. Richard had rewritten everything 8 months before he passed, during a time I thought we were just going to doctor's visits and trying new medications. He had done it quietly, with total clarity, probably after seeing Jacob asking those subtle questions about tax strategies and Danielle's smiling inquiries about next steps. I could almost hear Richard's voice telling me to stop underestimating my own power. I made tea, though I didn't drink it, and paced the kitchen. I pulled the documents out again, double-checked the signature dates, verified that it was all real. And the more I stared at those papers, the more something shifted inside me. That feeling of being invisible, of being just a tag-along in someone else's legacy, began to fade, replaced by something else. Determination. Control. At 3:47 a.m., I picked up the landline, the same phone Richard had insisted on keeping in case of emergencies, and called Alan Kingsley, our lawyer for over 30 years. The one who slipped Richard fishing magazines during meetings and always called me Mrs. Rogers, even after I told him to call me Carol. He answered after 4 rings, his voice groggy but alert once I said my name. "I found the paperwork," I said without preamble. "The changes Richard made. I want to activate everything. Today." Alan paused for a second, then asked, "Does anyone else know about this?" "No," I said, "not yet." "Good," he replied, sounding more awake now. "Don't tell them. I'll be there by 9 with everything you need." I hung up and stood in the hallway, staring at our wedding photo on the wall, us on the courthouse steps, young and nervous, but completely in sync. I touched the frame and whispered, "I've got it now. You don't have to worry anymore." Then I sat back down, folded the documents into a clean manila folder, and placed it in my purse like it was a weapon, because that's exactly what it was. If they thought I was going to sit quietly while they carved up my life, they were about to learn exactly what kind of woman they'd pushed out the door. By the time Alan rang the doorbell at 8:57 a.m., I was already dressed in a blue suit I saved for special occasions, makeup carefully applied, hair styled the way Richard always liked it. The documents were spread across the dining table like a battle map, and I had a notebook filled with questions I'd written in the margins during my night of pacing. Alan stepped inside, looking exactly as he had for the past 20 years. Silver-haired, perpetually tanned from his weekend sailing trips, carrying the same worn leather portfolio he'd had since the boys were in elementary school. When he saw the envelope Richard had left me, his expression shifted from professional concern to something closer to grim satisfaction. "He told me you might not find this right away," Alan said, setting his briefcase on the table. "He was worried about that." "When did you know?" I asked, not accusingly, just curious. "He came to see me about 10 months ago, right after his first round of treatments. Said he'd seen something in Jacob's eyes when they were discussing the business that concerned him." Alan shook his head. "Richard always could read people." We spent the next 2 hours going through every clause, every legal term, every trigger point of the documents. Alan explained everything in detail, pausing whenever I needed clarification, making sure I understood the full scope of what Richard had put in place. By 11:15, I had signed 6 documents that transferred control of every asset, property, account, and business interest under my name. Not the family trust, not Jacob, not some future arrangement, just me. Alan made the final call to the estate manager, giving them verbal confirmation that all instructions should now come from me. It felt surreal hearing him say it out loud. "All further authorization rests solely with Mrs. Carol Rogers." I don't think I breathed for a full minute. Then Alan looked at me and asked, "Do you want them to find out through the systems, or do you want to call a meeting?" I thought about it for a second, remembering the dismissive chuckle, the way they'd talked around me all evening, the casual cruelty of Danielle's words. "Let them feel it," I said finally. "Let it hit like a car crash." Alan smiled slightly. "Good. That's the Carol I remember." And just like that, it was done. I spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone with Richard's brokerage manager, the property firm, the title company, and the accountant. Each one confirming that yes, my name was now the only name that mattered. By 3:00 p.m., I got a text from Jacob. "Hey, weird question, but do you know why the cabin account's locked?" I didn't answer. 5 minutes later, Danielle called. I let it go to voicemail. Her tone was sharp and sugary, the way it always is when she thinks she's about to manipulate something out of you. By 4:30, the family group chat lit up with messages about unexpected account issues. Michael, who rarely says anything at all in the group chat, finally sent. Did something change on Mom's end? That's when I knew the tremors had started. They hadn't even begun to realize what I'd done yet, but they could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. I waited until 5:05, just as I knew they'd all be gathering at Jacob's for another strategy dinner, and I walked up the stone path with my folder in hand and knocked on the door like I was just there to drop off a casserole. Jacob opened it, confusion evident on his face, his smile barely holding. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said simply, walking past him into the foyer. Danielle was in the kitchen, her posture stiffening when she saw me. Michael and Sarah were already seated at the dining table, looking uncomfortable. "Good." "What's going on with the accounts?" Jacob asked, not even bothering with pleasantries. "Everything's frozen." I walked to the counter, set the folder down, and said, "You all might want to sit down." They didn't, of course. Jacob remained standing with his arms crossed. Danielle leaned against the counter, her expression a masterclass in controlled irritation. Only Michael and Sarah actually took seats. I opened the folder slowly, laid out the documents, and said, "This is the new estate plan. Everything is under my name. Everything." There was silence. Not the shocked kind, but the arrogant kind. The kind that thinks it's about to outsmart you. Jacob snorted and said, "You can't just move money around without the trust board's approval." I looked him dead in the face and said, "There is no trust board. Your father dissolved it last year." I tapped the document with my index finger. "You didn't read the fine print." Danielle stepped forward, trying to scan the papers with her 2 long nails and her practiced smile. "There's no way this is binding." That's when I handed her the final document, the notarized copy with Alan's signature and date stamp from that morning. Her eyes widened slightly as she scanned it, her composure slipping for just a moment before she caught herself. "This is ridiculous," she said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "This isn't a negotiation," I said calmly. "This is a notification. As of this morning, none of you have any legal claim to any of it. Not the house you're standing in, not the cabin, not the business accounts, nothing." No one moved. No one spoke. It was the first time in years that room had been quiet while I stood in it. I turned to leave, paused at the door, and added, "The next time you want to discuss my future, you'll need an appointment." I didn't slam the door. I didn't make a scene. I just walked away and left them standing in the house Richard and I had paid for, choking on the control they thought they had. The next morning I was making coffee in my kitchen, the old drip machine sputtering like it always does when it's almost done, when my phone began to light up with notifications. 5 missed calls from Jacob, 3 from Danielle, and 1 from Michael, who predictably had waited until the storm started before poking his head out. I ignored them all and sat quietly at the table with my mug, watching the steam rise and wondering if they'd even gotten a full night's sleep. Part of me hoped they hadn't. Around 9:12 a.m., Jacob finally sent a text that was less aggressive and more confused. "Can we just talk? This is getting out of hand." That told me everything. They were unraveling, scrambling to understand what had happened. By noon, Alan called to tell me that Jacob had tried to access 2 accounts from his business laptop, and both attempts had been flagged by the system. "Good," I told Alan. "Let him dig." An hour later, Danielle showed up at my front door uninvited, wearing oversized sunglasses like I wouldn't recognize her through tinted plastic and lip filler. She stood on the porch, one hand on her hip, looking like she was delivering bad news to a neighbor she secretly hated. "Carol," she started with that tight smile and the voice she always uses when she's pretending not to be furious. "We're all a little confused here. Why would Richard do this behind everyone's back?" I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Maybe because he knew what you'd do in front of it." She flinched like I'd slapped her. Her smile faltered, then returned more forced than before. You know this isn't what Richard would have wanted for the family, she pressed, a slight edge creeping into her voice. All this division, all this distrust. What Richard wanted, I said slowly, making sure each word landed, was for me to be protected from exactly this conversation. What are you talking about? She feigned innocence, but her eyes darted away from mine. Last night you told me to stay quiet because I'm just the widow. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences for that? Her face hardened. That was just a casual comment. You're completely overreacting. And you're trespassing, I replied. This is my property. Please leave. You can't be serious, she said with a forced laugh. Carol, be reasonable. I'm family. No, I corrected her. You're my son's wife. And right now, you're not welcome here. She tried to throw out some vague threat about lawyers, but I closed the door before she finished her sentence. Through the peephole, I watched her stand there for a moment, shocked at being dismissed, before she turned and stalked back to her car. 10 minutes later, Michael called, his voice low like he didn't want Sarah to hear him. Mom, I didn't know about any of this, he said quickly. I thought the trust was just automatic. I didn't even know Danielle and Jacob were pushing for control. I could hear the guilt in his voice, or maybe just the fear of being cut off. You had every chance to ask me directly, I told him. You were at that dinner. You heard what Danielle said. You said nothing. That silence is your signature, Michael. He didn't respond for a long moment. What happens now? Now you all learn that actions have consequences, I said, and that I'm not just the widow to be pushed aside. He didn't respond, just hung up. That night I cooked myself dinner for one. Roast chicken with rosemary, mashed potatoes with a little too much butter, green beans with lemon and almonds. I ate at the dining room table with a proper place setting and a glass of the good wine Richard and I had been saving for a special occasion. It was the first meal I'd truly enjoyed since the funeral, because I was done eating scraps while others feasted off my sacrifices. As I was pouring a second glass of wine, the landline rang again. This time it was Lily, her voice quiet, almost shaking. Grandma, I don't know what's going on, but Mom and Dad are freaking out. They said something about money being gone and the house being in trouble. Are you okay? That hit me harder than anything else. In all the calculations and legal maneuvers, I hadn't considered how this would affect my grandchildren. I softened immediately. I'm fine, sweetheart. This is adult business between your parents and me. You didn't do anything wrong. She hesitated, then whispered, I miss Grandpa. He would have hated all this fighting. I swallowed hard and told her the truth. That's why he fixed it before it broke, honey. After we hung up, I sat alone at the table, surrounded by quiet, and felt something I hadn't felt since the funeral. Not grief, not rage, but clarity. Richard had seen this coming, and he'd put the tools in my hands to stand my ground. Jacob had lost access to the accounts he thought were his. Danielle had no legal hold on the house she bragged about to her yoga friends. Michael was just now realizing that silence didn't mean innocence. And Lily, the only one with any heart left in that family, was caught in the middle. I knew this was only the beginning. People like Jacob and Danielle don't fold easily. They scramble, they twist, they look for loopholes. But what they didn't understand yet was that I wasn't some grieving old woman waiting for their approval. I was the firewall now, and if they wanted to challenge me, they better come prepared for the next blow. Because Carol Rogers wasn't staying quiet anymore, and this was just day one. The morning after I dropped my bombshell, the silence in my house felt different. Not empty, but expectant. Like the calm before a thunderstorm, when the air is charged with electricity. I'd slept better than I had in months. No dreams, no tossing and turning, just a deep quiet that settled in my bones like peace finally punching through the noise. When I checked my email over coffee, I found a new message from the estate's financial advisor confirming that every major asset had been secured. The message ended with one sentence I couldn't stop rereading. You now hold 100% control. And for the first time since Richard died, I actually believed it. My phone buzzed with another text from Jacob. Mom, we need to talk. This is getting out of hand. We can fix this. Fix this. As if my exercising control over my own property was something broken. I was halfway through my toast when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Michael shifting uncomfortably on my front step, looking more like the teenager who'd been caught breaking curfew than a 38-year-old man. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. Mom, he started, his voice already apologetic. This whole thing is spiraling. Jacob's furious, Danielle's talking about lawyers, and I'm just trying to understand what's happening. What's happening is consequences, I said simply. Did you think I'd just fade into the background after what Danielle said? After you all sat there and let her say it? Michael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like Richard that it made my chest ache. I know, I should have said something, but you know how it gets when Danielle starts, I just froze. You always freeze, Michael, that's the problem. His face flushed. That's not fair. No? Then where were you when Jacob and Danielle started planning to take over the estate? Where were you when they consulted lawyers without telling me? Where have you been for the past 6 months while they've been pushing me out of my own family? He looked down at his shoes. I didn't know about the lawyers. Because you didn't want to know, I said, softer now. It was easier to look away. What can I do? He asked finally. To fix this? I studied my younger son's face, the boy who had always wanted everyone to get along, who had spent his whole life compromising to keep the peace. Start by standing for something, Michael, even if it's hard, even if Jacob and Danielle don't like it. He nodded slowly, his eyes meeting mine with something like resolve. I'm sorry about the dinner, about everything. I know you are, I said. But being sorry isn't the same as doing better. As he turned to leave, I called after him. Michael, the next time Danielle calls me just the widow, I expect you to say something. He nodded once, firmly, and walked back to his car. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Sarah, Michael's wife, the last person I expected to hear from. Carol, she said, her voice lower than usual. I need to tell you something, and I don't want Michael to know I called. My hand tightened around the phone. Go on. Last month, Jacob asked Michael to sign some papers, something about consolidating business assets. Michael didn't really understand what they were, but Jacob made it sound urgent. She paused. I think it might have something to do with what's happening now. I closed my eyes, letting this new information sink in. Thank you for telling me, Sarah. Michael's not a bad person, she said quickly. He looks up to Jacob so much. Always has. I know, I said. But sometimes the people we look up to aren't looking out for us. After we hung up, I called Alan immediately and told him about the papers Michael had signed. I'll look into it, Alan promised. In the meantime, don't engage with any of them about financial matters. Let them come to us. Later that afternoon, I was pruning roses in the garden when I saw Lily's familiar yellow bicycle leaning against the fence. She appeared moments later, looking over her shoulder as if worried she'd been followed. Mom and Dad think I'm at swim practice, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I had to see you. I put down my gardening shears and hugged her tightly, feeling how thin she'd become in just the few months since Richard's death. What's wrong, sweetheart? Everything, she said, her voice cracking. Dad's locked himself in his office, yelling on the phone. Mom keeps saying you've lost your mind and that they need to protect the family assets. Jack's confused and no one will tell him anything. She looked up at me, her eyes wide. Grandma, what's really going on? I led her to the garden bench, taking a moment to choose my words carefully. Your parents wanted to take control of everything your grandfather and I built together. They thought because he's gone, I would just hand it all over. But why? She asked, so innocent in her confusion. Power, I said simply. Money, control, all the things adults fight about when they forget what really matters. Like family, she said softly. Exactly like family. I squeezed her hand. But I want you to know that none of this is your fault. And no matter what happens between me and your parents, I will always be your grandmother. She nodded, wiping away a tear that had escaped. Dad said we might have to move, that we might lose the house. I felt a sharp pang of guilt. I hadn't considered how my actions would affect my grandchildren's stability. The house is safe, I assured her. I would never take your home away, Lily. But your parents need to understand that actions have consequences. Like when you tell me there's no phone privileges if my grades slip. I smiled at her simple but perfect comparison. Exactly like that, but much bigger. Lily stayed for another hour, helping me with the roses and talking about school, her friends, normal teenage things that had nothing to do with frozen accounts or family power struggles. It was the most peace I'd felt in days. As she was leaving, she hugged me tight and whispered, I'm on your side, Grandma, even if I can't say it at home. I watched her bike away, her dark hair streaming behind her, and felt a renewed certainty that I was doing the right thing. Not just for me, but for her too, to show her that women don't have to become invisible when they're no longer convenient. That night, I received an email from Jacob's company email address. Formal, cold, addressing me as Carol rather than Mom. We need to resolve this situation immediately. Your actions are affecting the business and our family's financial stability. I've scheduled a meeting with our legal team tomorrow at 2 p.m. Please attend if you wish to avoid further complications. I forwarded it to Alan with a simple message. They're escalating. His response came minutes later. Let them. We're just getting started. 2 days after I shut the door on Danielle and sent that message without saying a word, Alan called with a tone that made me sit down before he even started talking. There's something you need to see, he said grimly. How soon can you come to my office? An hour later, I was sitting across from him in the same place Richard and I used to go every April to sign papers and drink burnt coffee out of tiny chipped mugs. The law office hadn't changed in 30 years. Still the same wood paneling, the same slightly faded diplomas on the wall, the same feeling of solid reliability. Alan slid a folder across the desk without saying a word. When I opened it, I didn't understand at first. Just a bunch of bank statements, account transfers, loan agreements, all with Jacob's name on them. He used Richard's business line of credit as collateral, Alan finally said. $500,000, maybe more, depending on what's still being uncovered. My hands went cold as I flipped through the papers again, slower this time, watching as dates and figures started aligning. Is this fraud? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He signed as a partner, Alan confirmed. But that partnership was dissolved when Richard passed, which means these transactions were unauthorized. He had no legal right to use those funds. When did this start? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Alan pointed to a date on one of the statements. The first transaction hit 2 weeks after Richard's first surgery. I stared at the numbers until they stopped looking like numbers and started looking like betrayal, the kind that rots from the inside out. The new SUV Jacob had bought last year, the sudden remodel of their kitchen, The ski trip to Aspen they'd said was sponsored by work contacts. It was all tied to money that wasn't his, money he had no legal right to touch. He did this while Richard was still sick, I said half to myself. Alan nodded gravely. The timing suggests he knew exactly what he was doing. I closed the folder, feeling suddenly exhausted. What do we do now? That depends, Alan said carefully. We could press charges. Banking fraud is serious. He could face criminal penalties. Or we can use this as leverage. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I drove home without music, without stopping, and went straight to Richard's study. I pulled out the old leather journal he kept tucked behind the encyclopedias, the place where he scribbled notes during tax season. And sure enough, on one of the last pages, in his neat, slanted handwriting, was a list of things to double-check. Jacob's withdrawals looking fishy. Ask Alan. He must have known. He must have suspected and never got the chance to finish investigating. And now it was my job to do what he couldn't. That night I didn't sleep again. I sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread out in front of me like puzzle pieces, staring at the proof that my son, my flesh and blood, had stolen from us while we were drowning in doctor visits and chemo side effects. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just made another folder, labeled it Evidence, and started making notes. What assets could I freeze? What debts could I call in? What investments could I liquidate that Jacob might still be using as collateral for his fraudulent dealings? The next morning I called Alan and told him, "Don't press charges yet. Let him stew. I want him broke before he's scared." That same day, I called the estate accountant, Robert Wilson, a man I hadn't seen since Richard's retirement party 4 years ago, and asked him point blank, "Did you know about Jacob's unauthorized transactions?" There was a long pause on the line before he admitted, "I had concerns, but your name wasn't on anything until now. My hands were tied." "Well, now they're not," I said firmly. "I want to know everything. Every transaction, every account, every red flag you saw but couldn't investigate." And he told me, for over an hour. He told me about suspicious fund movements, irregular payments to shell companies, and how Jacob had likely been building up debt under the false belief that when Richard died he'd inherit everything and could clean it all up afterward. It wasn't just greed, it was arrogance. He never once thought I'd be the one holding the pen when the dust settled. That night I sent Jacob a single text message. "You might want to get a lawyer, an accountant, and a very cheap apartment." I didn't get a reply, but I didn't need one, because the only thing louder than his silence was the sound of everything he thought was his slipping straight through my hands. The next morning, Robert called again. "I found something else," he said, his voice tense. "Jacob's been paying himself a management fee from Richard's private investment account, $20,000 a month for the past year. He's been backdating the authorizations." I felt sick. "That's nearly $250,000. And it gets worse," Robert continued. "He's been using that money to make payments on a vacation property in Vail, a place he never mentioned to you." I thought about all the times Jacob had claimed he was barely making ends meet during the pandemic, how he'd talked about sacrifices and tight budgets while stealing from his dying father. "Send me everything," I told Robert, "and freeze that investment account immediately." By afternoon, I had another call, this time from the manager of the lake house property Richard and I had bought 20 years ago, the place where we'd spent every summer when the boys were growing up. "Mrs. Rogers, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a situation," he said hesitantly. "Mr. Jacob Rogers has been renting out the property on a short-term rental site for the past 8 months. We've received several complaints about parties and property damage." Another betrayal, another secret. The lake house had been our family sanctuary, the place where Richard had taught the boys to fish, where we'd watched sunsets from the deck and made memories that were supposed to last lifetimes. And Jacob had turned it into a party rental without even telling me. I authorized the property manager to change all locks and security codes immediately and to cancel any pending reservations. The house is not available for rent anymore, I told him. Not by anyone? That evening, my doorbell rang just as I was finishing dinner. When I opened it, I found Michael standing there again, but this time with a folder of his own. "You need to see this," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I found it when I was looking through some papers Sarah mentioned." Inside were copies of loan documents with both Jacob's and Michael's signatures, loans against properties that belonged to Richard and me, with terms that made no sense, and interest rates that bordered on predatory. "I swear I didn't know what I was signing," Michael said, his face pale. Jacob said it was just standard paperwork for the business expansion, that Dad had approved it before he got sick. I believed him. Michael had always been trusting to a fault, especially when it came to his older brother. "He used you," I said softly, "just like he used all of us." Michael's eyes filled with tears. "What do we do now?" "We stop him," I said simply, "before he destroys everything your father built." 3 days later, to my complete surprise, an invitation appeared in my email inbox. A family barbecue at Jacob's house, as if nothing had happened. As if we hadn't flipped the family tree upside down and shaken all the rotten pieces to the ground. "Is this a joke?" I asked Alan when I forwarded it to him. "It's a trap," he replied. "They're either desperate or planning something. Either way, be careful." Every instinct told me to ignore it, to stay home and let them eat their lies in peace. But there was something compelling about the audacity of it, the sheer nerve it took to invite me for burgers after everything that had happened. So I accepted. I wore the pearl earrings Richard had given me for our 30th anniversary and brought a bottle of red wine I knew none of them could afford anymore. When I walked into the backyard, the whole scene looked staged. Fake smiles, plastic tablecloths, and music just loud enough to avoid real conversation. Danielle was wearing white, like she was trying to prove something about her innocence. Jacob was behind the grill, pretending to be a provider, flipping burgers like the world wasn't burning under his feet. Michael nodded at me awkwardly, and Sarah gave me a small, encouraging smile. I didn't wait long. I walked right up to the picnic table, dropped my folder on it, and said, "We need to talk, now." Danielle rolled her eyes dramatically. "Can't this wait until after we eat? This is supposed to be a nice family gathering." "No," I said firmly. "It can't wait." Jacob muttered something under his breath and set down his spatula. Michael reached for a beer, like a kid trying to avoid a fight. I opened the folder and laid out the documents one by one. The loan fraud, the forged partnership extension, the unauthorized fund transfers, the secret Vale property, the lake house rental scheme. Everything. "This is what Jacob did while your father was dying," I said flatly without raising my voice. "Because people don't forget what you say. They remember how calm you were when you said it." Jacob forced a laugh. "This is ridiculous. That's not even—" But I cut him off. "It's not a guess. It's notarized, confirmed, and documented. And the only reason you're not in jail right now is because I'm giving you one last chance to own it." Danielle stepped forward, her voice shrill. "This is a setup. He didn't steal anything. Richard would have told us if there was a problem." I turned to her slowly, eyes level, and said, "Richard saw it. He just didn't trust you to fix it." For once, she had nothing to say. Lily, who'd been sitting quietly near the fence, watching everything with wide eyes, suddenly looked at Jacob like she was seeing him for the first time, seeing through the facade to the truth underneath. I turned back to Jacob. "You're going to start signing things over today. The Vale property, the investment returns, everything you took that wasn't yours. You don't get to enjoy the pieces of what you tried to destroy." Jacob's jaw clenched, his chest heaving. You're going to burn this whole family down over some paperwork? I leaned in slightly. No. You did that when you stole from your father's grave. That shut him up completely. I gathered my documents, nodded to Michael and Sarah, and started walking toward the back gate. Behind me, I heard Danielle mutter, "You're bitter. That's all this is. A bitter old woman who couldn't let go." I stopped but didn't turn around. "No," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm the woman who paid for this entire yard. And I just decided you're not welcome in it anymore." Then I walked through the gate and didn't look back. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of that expensive wine and sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. I wasn't happy exactly, but I was free. And freedom, it turns out, tastes a hell of a lot better than forced smiles and stolen money. The following Monday, I met with a real estate attorney and gave him a list of all the properties Richard and I still legally owned. The lake house Jacob had been secretly renting out, the downtown condo Michael had been managing poorly, and even the SUV Danielle used to drive Lily to school in while calling it a gift from Jacob's hard work. I signed the sale orders one by one. No hesitation, no ceremony, just clean signatures that felt like removing tumors from the body of a family that had stopped functioning years ago. The lawyer asked if I wanted to notify them personally or let the paperwork speak for itself. I chose the latter. "They didn't invite me into the room when they thought they were dividing the kingdom," I said. "I'm not giving them a stage now that it's collapsing." By Friday, Jacob's business account had been drained of illegal equity. Danielle's credit cards were declined at a boutique in Westport, according to Sarah, who still kept me informed. And Michael called, sounding breathless, asking if the building manager was serious about terminating his lease on the downtown condo. "Yes," I told him. "The next person living there will pay rent like the rest of the world." The storm was breaking, and I was standing firmly in the eye of it, watching as everything they'd taken for granted washed away. I was halfway through my morning toast a week later when the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I saw no car in the driveway, no person on the porch. But when I opened the door, a white envelope lay on the welcome mat. No return address, just my name printed in shaky handwriting. At first, I thought it might be from Lily, perhaps something she didn't want to send electronically. But when I opened it, what fell out stopped me cold. A copy of a psychiatric recommendation form, unsigned, but marked with an aggressive red highlighter around the words, "Capacity Evaluation Recommended." I knew immediately what it was. I'd seen enough of Richard's legal briefs over the years to recognize a setup when I saw one. Someone, and I didn't need to guess who, was trying to file paperwork to challenge my control of the estate under the claim that I was mentally unfit. I held the page between my fingers and didn't feel fear, just a cold, slow-burning insult. They'd finally run out of courage and were resorting to the lowest form of attack. That afternoon, I drove to Alan's office and dropped the envelope on his desk without a word. He glanced through it, eyebrows lifting slowly. "They actually went this route," he said, more statement than question. "That's bold and stupid." I nodded once. "Trace it. I want to know who ordered the evaluation, who wrote it, and who forged my access to medical records." 2 days later, Alan called me back, his voice as sharp as I'd ever heard it. It was Danielle. She approached a notary who owed her a favor and tried to backdate the file. "We've got emails. One of the assistants turned them over voluntarily. Apparently, she didn't like being asked to commit a felony on a Sunday morning." I sat down, my knees suddenly weak. It was one thing to fight over money, over property, over who controlled what, but to try to declare me mentally incompetent? To attempt to strip away my autonomy, my dignity, my very personhood? "Press charges," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "Are you sure?" Alan asked carefully. "This is your daughter-in-law we're talking about." "No," I corrected him. This is a criminal who happens to be married to my son. Press charges, Alan. All of them. He was already in motion. I'll file the papers today. That evening, I got a frantic call from Jacob. What the hell are you doing? He shouted, not even bothering with pleasantries. The sheriff just left our house. They're saying Danielle committed fraud. She did, I said simply. Forging medical documents and attempting to file false competency claims is a felony, Jacob. Your wife found that out the hard way. This is insane. You're tearing this family apart over nothing. Nothing? I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. Your wife tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could take control of my assets. And you think that's nothing? She was just trying to protect our family. No, Jacob. She was trying to steal what isn't hers. And now she's facing the consequences. He was quiet for a moment, then said in a lower voice, Mom, please, drop the charges. We can work this out as a family. We stopped being a family the moment you started stealing from your dying father, I replied. And we stopped being a family the moment Danielle told me to shut up, widow. This isn't about family anymore. This is about justice. I hung up before he could respond. The next morning, the local paper's online edition had a small item in the legal notices section. Danielle Rogers, 42, charged with forgery and attempted fraud in estate case. It was just 3 lines, barely noticeable to most readers, but in our social circles, it might as well have been front-page news. By noon, I had 5 missed calls from various friends and acquaintances, all suddenly concerned about my well-being, all suddenly curious about this awful situation with Jacob and Danielle. I ignored them all. Their concern hadn't been evident when I was grieving Richard. It wasn't welcome now that I was fighting back. Lily texted me around 3. Mom's been crying all day. Dad won't talk to anyone. Is it true she might go to jail? I hesitated before responding. I didn't want to scare Lily, but I wouldn't lie to her either. The charges are serious, but first-time offenders rarely serve jail time. She'll likely get probation and a fine. But yes, what she did was illegal. Why would she do that? Lily asked. People do desperate things when they're losing control, I replied. But none of this is your fault, Lily. Remember that. Later that evening, a county sheriff's vehicle pulled into Jacob's driveway while they were unloading groceries from the back of a borrowed sedan. According to Sarah, who heard it from the neighbor across the street, Danielle screamed and shouted and sobbed like someone who'd rehearsed it 1,000 times, but it didn't stop them from reading her the charges on the sidewalk. Forgery, fraud, attempted abuse of the court system. Jacob tried to intervene, but the deputy shut him down instantly with a hand on his chest. Sir, step back or you'll be joining her. I wasn't there to see it, but Lily told me later, her voice quiet like she was ashamed to know them. She tried to say it was your fault, Lily whispered, but nobody believed her, not even Dad. Some people don't break, I told Lily gently. They rot from the inside until there's nothing left but noise. She didn't say anything after that, but I could hear her breathing on the line. And for once, it felt like maybe someone in that house was finally seeing through the curtain. The courthouse hearing for Danielle's arraignment was set for the following Tuesday. I didn't attend. Alan advised against it, saying my presence might inflame tensions unnecessarily. Instead, I spent the morning in Richard's study, going through old photo albums, reminding myself of the family we used to be before greed and resentment took over. There were so many happy moments captured in those pages. Jacob's high school graduation, Michael's wedding, family trips to the lake house. Richard beaming with pride, his arm around both boys. Me, younger and smiling without reservation. Where had it all gone wrong? When had Jacob decided that what we freely gave wasn't enough? Alan called me after the hearing concluded. She took a deal, he said without preamble. Pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for probation, community service, and a $50,000 fine. I nodded to myself, unsurprised. Danielle would never risk a trial, not with digital records tied to her personal email and witness statements from the notary's assistant who had given a sworn deposition in exchange for immunity. "Is it over?" I asked, meaning not just the legal proceedings, but all of it. The fighting, the schemes, the betrayal. "For now," Alan replied cautiously. "But Jacob's still facing potential charges for the financial fraud. That investigation is ongoing." I closed my eyes, feeling suddenly weary. "I don't want my son to go to jail, Alan." "I know you don't," he said gently. "But some choices have consequences that can't be erased with just an apology." After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, looking at a photo of Jacob as a boy, gap-toothed and beaming, holding up a fish he'd caught at the lake. Where was that boy now? When had he become a man who would steal from his parents, who would stand by while his wife tried to destroy his mother's autonomy? Michael called later that afternoon, his voice subdued. "I heard about Danielle. Jacob's not speaking to anyone." "And you?" I asked. "Where do you stand in all this now?" He was quiet for a moment. "I've been blind, Mom. For years. I let Jacob make decisions because it was easier than fighting him. I let Danielle set the tone because confronting her was exhausting. I failed you and Dad both." It was the most honest thing Michael had said to me in years, and it loosened something tight in my chest. "It's not too late to do better," I told him. "I know," he said quietly. "Sarah and I have been talking. We think we need some distance from Jacob and Danielle for a while. Some space to figure out who we are without their influence." "That sounds wise," I said, careful not to push too hard in this fragile moment of growth. "And Mom," he added hesitantly, "I'd like to bring the kids over this weekend if that's okay. They miss you, and I miss you too." For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope that not everything was broken beyond repair. "I'd like that very much," I said. The plea deal made the local news that evening, a small item, but enough to ensure that everyone in our social circle would know what had happened. My phone lit up with more messages from so-called friends, their curiosity barely disguised as concern. I ignored them all except for one, a text from my old friend Margaret, who had stood by me at Richard's funeral when others had already started drifting toward Jacob and Danielle's orbit of influence. "I always knew that woman was trouble," Margaret wrote. "Are you okay, Carol? Really okay?" "I'm getting there," I replied honestly. "It's been a hard road." "Well, when you're ready for company and a good bottle of wine, you know where to find me. No questions asked unless you want to talk." That night I found myself back in Richard's study, sitting in his chair, surrounded by the remnants of his life. The books he'd read, the pens he'd used, the paperweights he collected from every city we'd visited together. I opened his desk drawer and found a small notepad where he'd jotted down ideas and reminders. On one of the last pages, in his familiar handwriting, was a note that made my eyes fill with tears. "Make sure Carol knows she did it all. I just stood beside her." I didn't cry. I just folded the note carefully and placed it in the top drawer of his desk where I kept the original will, the keys to our safety deposit box, and now perhaps a measure of peace. By Friday, I had closed the last joint account tied to Jacob's fake business entity, donated the remaining inventory from Richard's old warehouse to a local business incubator, and sent an official cease and desist letter to the last law firm still taking Jacob's calls. The rebuild wasn't flashy. It wasn't fun, but it was mine and Richard's, and no longer weighed down by the greedy hands of people who had his blood, but none of his integrity. For the first time in months, as I sat on my front porch drinking coffee while contractors replaced the rotting fence panels we'd been putting off fixing. I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was rebuilding from the ashes, and I was doing it on my own damn terms. Jacob didn't speak to me at all after Danielle's plea deal. Not to defend her, not to apologize, not even to threaten me. Just radio silence, the kind that tells you someone has finally realized the ground beneath them is gone. But Lily still texted me daily. Small messages about school and friends and normal teenage things that felt like lifelines to a future where maybe, just maybe, this family might find its way back to something resembling love. "Mom says we have to sell the house," she wrote one evening. "Dad says we're downsizing. Is that because of you?" I sat with that question for a long time before responding. It's because of choices, honey. And sometimes choices have consequences we don't expect. "I don't blame you," she wrote back immediately. "I heard what Mom said to you that night. It was cruel." Out of the mouths of babes, I thought. Even a teenager could recognize the cruelty that Jacob and Danielle had tried to disguise as practical financial planning. "Thank you for that," I replied. "And Lily, the house you moved to doesn't matter. What matters is that it feels like home." "Nothing feels like home anymore," she admitted, "except maybe your house." And in those 6 simple words, I found more validation than all the legal victories combined. I spent the next week shifting gears, not out of revenge anymore, but necessity. There were taxes to file, property closures to finalize, and most importantly, decisions to make about what this entire fight would mean now that the smoke had begun to clear. The morning after Danielle's court hearing, I woke up with a strange sense of emptiness. The fury that had propelled me forward had faded, leaving behind a hollow space that needed to be filled with something else, something better. I wasn't going to hold on to every asset like a dragon hoarding gold. That had never been the point. I just wanted what was mine, and what Richard and I built together, to be protected from rot. To mean something beyond bank statements and property deeds. So I called Robert, the estate accountant, and scheduled a meeting at my house rather than his sterile office. When he arrived, his usual professional distance was tempered with something like respect. "You've done what many people only dream of doing," he said as he spread financial statements across my dining room table. "You stood your ground." At what cost? I wondered aloud, thinking of the family fractured beyond recognition, of Jacob's silence, of Danielle's hatred. "At the cost of truth," Robert said simply, "and truth is never cheap." We spent 3 hours going through every asset, every account, every property Richard and I had accumulated over 4 decades of careful planning and hard work. The lake house, the downtown commercial building, the rental properties, the investment accounts, the retirement funds that would keep me comfortable until the end of my days. "What do you want to do with it all?" Robert asked finally. "You have options now." I looked out the window at the garden Richard had planted, at the roses just starting to bloom despite weeks of neglect, life continuing despite everything. "I want to do something he would be proud of," I said. That afternoon I drove to the smaller house outside town, the one with the porch swing and yellow shutters that Richard always said reminded him of his grandmother's place in Vermont. We'd bought it as a rental property years ago, but the current tenants had moved out 3 months earlier, and I hadn't had the energy to find new ones. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. It was a modest house, nothing like Jacob and Danielle's glass mansion, but it had character, warmth, the kind of solid foundation that could weather storms. I stood on the porch, looking out at the maple tree in the front yard, and suddenly knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. When I got home, I called Alan. "I want to transfer ownership of the Cedar Street house," I told him, "into Lily's name." There was a pause on the line. "She's 17, he reminded me gently. "Then put it in a trust for her," I said. "One that gives her full control when she turns 18 next year. I want it to be hers. Free and clear." "Are you sure?" Alan asked carefully. "That's a significant asset." "I'm sure," I said without hesitation. "She's the only one in that whole family who never tried to play me, who never looked away when things got hard. I want her to have something that can't be twisted or clawed back." "I'll draw up the paperwork today," Alan promised. I debated how to tell her. A text message seemed too casual for something this significant. A formal meeting felt too stilted. In the end, I simply invited her for lunch on Saturday, claiming I could use her help with some gardening afterward. She arrived on her bicycle, cheeks flushed from the ride, wearing jeans with artistic tears that I'd never understand, and a sweatshirt from her high school swim team. We ate sandwiches on the porch and talked about normal things, her upcoming exams, a movie she wanted to see, a friend's drama with her boyfriend. After lunch, as we pulled weeds from around Richard's rose bushes, I finally said, "Lily, I've been thinking about the future, about what happens to everything your grandfather and I built." She looked up, soil smudging her cheek. "Is that why Dad's been so weird? Because you're changing your will or something?" I smiled slightly. "Something like that. But today I want to talk about you specifically." Her brow furrowed. "Me? Why?" "Because you've shown more maturity and compassion throughout this whole mess than most of the adults involved," I said honestly. "And I want to make sure you have options when you graduate next year." "Like college?" she asked. "Dad says we can't afford the schools I want anymore." I felt a surge of anger at Jacob for using college as a weapon, but pushed it aside. "You'll have options for college, Lily. I promise. But that's not what I wanted to tell you." I took a deep breath. "I've decided to give you the house on Cedar Street. It will be yours when you turn 18. She stared at me, blinking rapidly. A whole house? But why?" "Because I trust you," I said simply. "Because I want you to have security that no one can take away from you. Because you deserve to start your adult life on solid ground." Her eyes filled with tears. Not the performative kind Danielle had perfected, but soft, shocked tears that seemed to break something loose inside her. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. I reached out and took her dirt-smudged hand in mine. "You do," I told her firmly. "Because you didn't pretend." She threw her arms around me then, soil and all, and held on like she was afraid I might disappear. We sat like that for a long time, surrounded by half-weeded roses, the sun warm on our backs. "Please don't tell your parents yet," I said finally. "The paperwork isn't finished, and I'd rather wait until everything's legally settled." She nodded against my shoulder. "It'll be our secret." That night, after Lily had gone home with promises to return the next weekend, I sat at Richard's desk with a fresh legal pad and began to write. Not a will or a trust document, but a mission statement of sorts. At the top, I wrote, "The Richard Rogers Second Chance Fund." Below it, I outlined my vision, a grant program for widowed women over 60 who had been pushed aside, shut out of financial decisions, or left holding the scraps after their husbands passed. Women like me, but without the safety net Richard had quietly built. The fund would provide legal assistance, financial planning services, and in some cases, direct financial support. It would help women understand their rights, challenge unfair arrangements, and build new lives on their own terms. I worked until almost midnight, the ideas flowing faster than I could write them down. By the time I finally went to bed, I had 8 pages of notes and a renewed sense of purpose. The next morning, I called a nonprofit consultant who had worked with Richard on some of his charitable initiatives. She came over that afternoon, and we spent hours refining the concept, discussing legalities and mapping out a timeline. "This is powerful," she said, reviewing my notes, "and sadly, very needed. Do you know how many women end up financially devastated after their husbands die, often because of family dynamics very similar to what you experienced?" "Too many," I said quietly. "And most of them don't have a Richard looking out for them from beyond the grave." We set up the legal framework over the next week. I committed $2 million from my investment accounts as initial funding, enough to ensure the program could operate independently for years to come, even if no additional donations materialized. The first application came in before the website even launched. A handwritten letter from a woman in Kentucky whose children had emptied her bank account the day after her husband's funeral. I approved her grant request within 2 hours. As word spread through senior centers and widow support groups, more applications arrived. A woman in Oregon whose son had pressured her into signing over her house. A woman in Florida whose late husband's business partner was systematically cutting her out of profits. A woman in Arizona whose daughter had moved her into a small apartment and sold her family home without permission. Each story resonated with me, each one a variation on the same theme. Women rendered invisible once they became just the widow. I recruited a small board of directors, all women over 60, all with expertise in finance, law, or social work. We met weekly, reviewed applications, approved grants, and gradually built something that felt more meaningful than any revenge could ever be. One night, while sorting through paperwork, I found an old note Richard had scribbled on a dry cleaning receipt shoved between pages of his retirement binder. It said, "Make sure Carol knows she did it all. I just stood beside her." I didn't cry. I just folded it carefully and placed it in my jewelry box alongside the pearl earrings he'd given me. A reminder that the best parts of our marriage had always been about building each other up, not tearing others down. By Friday, I had closed the last joint account tied to Jacob's fake LLC, donated the remaining inventory from Richard's warehouse to a local business incubator, and sent an official cease and desist to the last law firm still foolish enough to take his calls. The rebuild wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, but it was mine and Richard's, and no longer weighed down by the greedy machinations of people who had his blood but none of his honor. For the first time in months, as I sat on my front porch drinking coffee while contractors replaced the rotting fence panels we'd put off fixing for years, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was rebuilding from the ashes, and I was doing it on my own damn terms. 3 weeks after Danielle's court appearance, a formal email arrived in my inbox from Jacob. The subject line read simply, "Family meeting request." The body was just as terse. "Saturday, 4 p.m. Our house. We need to talk as a family and resolve this situation once and for all." I forwarded it to Alan immediately. "Should I go?" His response came back within minutes. "Only if you want to. You hold all the cards now. But if you do go, I recommend bringing someone with you. Michael, perhaps." I considered it carefully. I had no obligation to attend, no reason to subject myself to what might be another ambush. But part of me wanted closure, needed it even. Not to forgive necessarily, but to finalize. To close this chapter properly before moving on to the next. I texted Michael. "Jacob's called a family meeting for Saturday. Will you go with me?" His reply was immediate. "Of course. I'll pick you up at 3:30. I spent the next few days preparing myself mentally, rehearsing what I might say, what accusations might come my way. By the time Saturday arrived, I felt surprisingly calm, like a storm that had already passed, leaving clarity in its wake. Michael was punctual, pulling into my driveway at exactly 3:30. He looked better than he had in months. Less drawn, more present. Sarah had told me he'd started therapy trying to understand the patterns that had led him to be so passive for so many years. "You don't have to do this," he said as we drove toward Jacob's house. "We can turn around any time you want." "I know," I said, patting his arm. "But I think I need to." Jacob and Danielle's house looked different somehow. Less imposing, less perfect. The lawn needed mowing. One of the front windows had a small crack in the corner, signs of financial strain already showing through the carefully curated facade. Michael rang the doorbell, standing slightly in front of me like a shield. I appreciated the gesture, even if I no longer needed protection. Jacob opened the door, looking thinner, more haggard than I remembered. The confident sheen had dulled, replaced by something closer to resignation. "You came," he said, sounding genuinely surprised. "Both of you." "We said we would," Michael replied evenly. Jacob stepped back to let us in. The house felt different inside too, emptier, with spaces on the walls where expensive artwork had hung, gaps on shelves where collectibles had stood. The downsizing had already begun. We followed him to the dining room, the site of that fateful dinner that had started it all. The table was set simply now, no elaborate place settings or crystal glasses. Danielle wasn't in sight. "Where's Danielle?" Michael asked, echoing my thoughts. "Part of her plea deal involves staying away from Mom," Jacob said flatly. "She's at her sister's for the weekend." I felt a small measure of relief, one less combatant in the arena. Lily was there, sitting quietly at the corner of the table, her eyes lighting up when she saw me, but quickly tempering her reaction. Jack, her younger brother, hovered near the kitchen entrance, looking confused and uncomfortable. Trevor, Jacob and Danielle's middle child, who had been away at college during most of the conflict, stood awkwardly by the window, clearly having been called home for this summit. "Should we sit?" Jacob asked, gesturing to the chairs. We arranged ourselves around the table like reluctant diplomats, Jacob at one end, me at the other, Michael and the children filling in the spaces between us. The physical distance felt appropriate. Jacob cleared his throat. "I've asked you here because this situation has gone on long enough. We need to find a way forward as a family." "A way forward," I repeated, keeping my voice neutral. "What exactly does that mean to you, Jacob?" He looked down at his hands. "I've made mistakes. Serious ones. I acknowledge that." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was more accountability than I'd expected. "The business is struggling," he continued. "Most of our assets are gone or frozen. Danielle's legal fees have depleted our savings." He looked up at me directly. "We're going to have to sell this house." I felt no satisfaction at this news, only a dull ache for the grandchildren who would be uprooted from the only home they'd known. "I'm not here to gloat," I said quietly, "or to twist the knife." "Then why are you here?" Jacob asked, a hint of his old defensiveness creeping back in. "Because despite everything, you're still my son, and they're still my grandchildren." I nodded toward Lily, Trevor, and Jack. "I wanted to hear what you had to say." Jacob ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like Richard that it made my heart clench. "I don't know where it all went wrong," he said finally. "When Dad got sick, I panicked. I saw everything we'd built potentially slipping away, and I made choices I can't take back." "It wasn't just panic," I said gently. "It was greed, Jacob. It was believing you deserved more than you'd earned." He didn't deny it, which was something. "What happens now?" he asked, looking defeated. "Are you going to press criminal charges for the financial discrepancies?" I considered him carefully. This man who had once been the little boy Richard had taught to ride a bike, to fish, to dream. Somewhere inside that little boy still existed, buried beneath layers of entitlement and fear. "No," I said finally. "I'm not pressing charges." Michael looked at me in surprise. "Mom?" Are you sure? After everything he did? I nodded. The civil penalties are sufficient. The business consequences are real. The family fallout is punishment enough. I looked directly at Jacob. But don't mistake mercy for weakness. The funds you took have been recovered. The legal protections remain in place, and I expect full transparency going forward. Jacob nodded slowly. Thank you, he said, the words sounding rusty from disuse. I'm not doing it for you, I said honestly. I'm doing it for them. I gestured toward his children. They deserve a father who rebuilds, not one who sits in a jail cell. Lily's eyes filled with tears, and even Trevor looked moved. Jack still seemed confused but relieved by the lowered tensions in the room. We're going to move to a smaller house in Riverdale, Jacob said after a moment. It's what we can afford now. The kids will have to switch schools next semester. I understand, I said, though my heart ached for Lily, who would have to complete her senior year in a new environment. Michael leaned forward. Maybe we should talk about regular family dinners again. Neutral territory. My house, perhaps. Jacob looked skeptical but nodded. We could try. And holidays? Michael pressed. The kids shouldn't lose that, too. One step at a time, I cautioned, not ready to commit to forced festivities with Danielle just yet. We talked for another hour, practical matters mostly. How to explain the changes to extended family and friends, when the house would go on the market, how to handle the upcoming school transitions. No one raised their voice. No one made accusations. It wasn't healing exactly, but it was civilized. The beginning of a new normal that might someday lead to something resembling family again. As the meeting wound down, Jacob walked us to the door. He hesitated, then asked quietly, The lake house, are you selling it too? I thought about that place, the site of so many family memories, good and bad. No, I said finally. I'm keeping it. And maybe someday your children can bring their children there. But that's a conversation for another day. He nodded, accepting the boundary and the small hope it contained. Michael and I walked to his car in silence. Once inside, he turned to me. Are you really not going to press charges? Really, I confirmed. Not because he deserves forgiveness, but because I deserve peace. And endless legal battles won't give me that. Michael drove me home, the setting sun casting long shadows across the road. As we pulled into my driveway, he said, You know, all my life I thought Dad was the strong one, the decisive one. But it was you all along, wasn't it? I smiled slightly. It was both of us, Michael. That's what partnership means, something I hope Jacob learned someday. I hugged my younger son goodbye, feeling a tentative bridge being rebuilt between us. Not the same as before, but perhaps eventually stronger for having been broken and mended. It wasn't until I stood in front of that long, polished table again, the same one where they'd told me to sit quietly just months earlier, that I realized how far I'd come and how far they'd fallen. Jacob had invited me to one final meeting before they vacated the house. Not a dinner, just a gathering. Some nonsense about reconnecting and resetting, like this was a technical error we could patch over with forced small talk. I didn't go to forgive anyone. I went because sometimes the people who try to erase you need to see you standing at full height, no longer asking for permission to exist. Danielle wasn't there. Part of her plea deal still required her to maintain distance from me. Michael and Sarah sat together, their hands intertwined on the table. Lily sat beside me, calmer now that her future was secure, the deed to the Cedar Street house safely in trust for her. Trevor and Jack completed the circle, both watching carefully, aware that something significant was happening, but not fully understanding the dynamics at play. Jacob stood at the head of the table like it was still his house, still his legacy, still his family to lead. but even he looked smaller now, diminished not by my actions but by the consequences of his own. He started with some practiced line about families weathering storms and coming out stronger, about how challenges reveal character and forge new bonds. But I wasn't interested in his script, in his attempt to reframe betrayal as growth opportunity. I set down my glass, looked at every person in the room, and said, "This isn't a storm, it's the consequence, and every one of you wrote it." You could have heard a pin drop. No one reached for their water. No one fidgeted or looked away. 6 months ago, we sat at this very table, and Danielle told me I was just the widow who should stay quiet, I continued, my voice steady. And not one of you contradicted her. Not one of you saw anything wrong with dismissing 45 years of partnership, of motherhood, of family building. Michael looked down, shame coloring his cheeks. "You didn't just disrespect me," I said. "You disrespected everything Richard and I built together, everything we sacrificed to give you the lives you've enjoyed, the education, the opportunities, the safety nets when you failed." Jacob opened his mouth, maybe to defend himself or throw one more excuse into the fire, but I cut him off with a raised hand. "You told me I was just the widow, that I should sit quietly. But I wasn't quiet when I built this family. I wasn't quiet when I kept it alive through hard times, and I sure as hell won't be quiet now that I've taken it back." I paused long enough to let that land, then added, "This table, this room, this legacy, I own them. Legally, emotionally, structurally. And I've learned that ownership means making choices about who shares in it." No one spoke. Even Jack, usually fidgety and distracted, sat perfectly still. "I've established the Richard Rogers Second Chance Fund," I said, changing tack. "A program that helps women who find themselves in situations like mine, but without the resources or support to fight back. Women whose families see them as accessories rather than architects of their own lives." I looked at Lily, whose eyes had widened with interest. "I'd like you to join the Junior Advisory Board, Lily. Your perspective would be valuable." She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "The fund is my legacy now," I continued, "along with the choices I make about this family's future. Some of you will be part of that future in meaningful ways. Others will need to earn their place back at the table, not through apologies, but through actions that demonstrate real change." I stood up, not because I was angry, but because I was finished. I'd said what I came to say. "You don't have to like me," I told them, looking at each face in turn. "You don't have to agree with my decisions. You just have to understand that I'm done making myself small so you can feel big." I walked toward the door, then turned back one last time. Richard always said the true test of character isn't how you act when things are easy, but what you do when facing the consequences of your own mistakes. I hope for all your sakes that you pass that test better than you've done so far. Then I left, not in anger or triumph, but with the quiet certainty that I had reclaimed not just my assets, but my voice, my place, my power. Outside, the sky was sharp and clear, the kind of light Richard used to say was perfect for new beginnings. As I got into my car, I didn't feel victorious or vindicated or even proud. I felt settled. I'd fought the fire and walked through it, and now I got to rebuild, not because someone gave me permission, but because I gave it to myself. And that, more than any revenge or inheritance or validation, was the win I never thought I'd get, but damn well earned. 3 months later, I hosted the first official event for the Richard Rogers Second Chance Fund. We'd already helped 17 women reclaim control of their finances, their properties, their lives. As I stood at the podium, looking out at a room full of women who had refused to be just the widow, I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the painful dinner, the shocking discovery, the battles fought and won. When someone tells you to be quiet, I told the crowd. That's precisely the moment to find your voice. When someone tries to make you invisible, that's when you need to stand in the light. And when someone dismisses you as just anything, a widow, a woman, a relic of someone else's life, that's when you remind them and yourself that you are entirely, completely, and powerfully whole. The applause washed over me like a cleansing rain, and somewhere, I was certain, Richard was applauding too. Not because I had won, but because I had refused to lose myself. And that made all the difference. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, check out 2 other channel favorites. My daughter-in-law banned me from my grandchild's birth, and they called me the poor grandma until they saw my bank account.